Hello, and welcome back to It's a Very Exciting Time, a podcast by a UFO nerd and his tolerant friend. My name is Scott, and I've been fascinated by the phenomenon my whole life.
And I'm Chuck. I'm an aerospace nerd, and, as this episode will attest, a very tolerant friend.
Very tolerant. We started this podcast because since 2017, there have been shocking revelations, from news of secret Pentagon programs to confirmed videos of astonishing craft. In a nutshell, now that we know the government has recovered non-human technology.
Or at least we will once Lou Elizondo's book comes out.
It raises a natural question. If UFOs are real, what else? Suddenly, some of these other parts of the phenomenon that seemed unlikely are pulled into the realm of the possible.
And they may still be unlikely, but even if it's new science and not aliens,
woo, it's a very exciting time.
It is. And a quick reminder before we dig in, you can find our show notes at veryexcitingtime.com or support us by going to patreon.com/veryexcitingtime, where you can find extra content like the Q&A we just recorded and a link to our Discord.
Link to our Discord.
Our Q&A this time was absurd.
It was. We got a little bit off topic. All right.
Reel us in.
Are you ready to get weird?
Let me guess. Congress is in recess already.
How'd you guess?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Good, because today we're going to be talking about remote viewing.
Oh, okay. Like VNC and remote desktop and that kind of thing.
No, you freaking
What's that have
nerd.
To do? Oh, okay. What's that have to do with aliens?
Well, let's talk about it.
Okay.
All right. We're going to do what everybody's favorite thing. Let's go to the dictionary.
Good. Okay.
Millennials and Gen X. We'll go to Wikipedia. Wikipedia says remote viewing is the practice of seeking impressions about a distant or unseen object, purportedly sensing with the mind. A remote viewer is expected to get information about an object, event, person, or location hidden from physical view and separated by some distance.
Okay, so it sounds like scrying and seances and stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Physicists Russell Targ and Hal Puthoff, who are parapsychology researchers at the Stanford Research Institute, SRI, are generally credited with coining the term remote viewing to distinguish it from the closely related concept of clairvoyance.
Oh, okay. So is this like, it sounds like they've redefined the term, like the military says UAP because UFO makes people think about little gray aliens. And
I think that's definitely a part of it. But also, this is one of the things I didn't know. I tend to just kind of think of psychic, and that's kind of everything. But there's actually a whole bunch of psychic phenomenon. There's telepathy, which is like mind-to-mind communication. There's telekinesis, which is moving things with your mind. And clairvoyance is one of the other things. Clairvoyance is kind of an umbrella term. Clairvoyance refers to the paranormal ability to see persons and events that are distant in time or space. It can be divided into roughly three classes. Precognition, which is the ability to perceive or predict future events. Retrocognition, which is the ability to see past events. And traveling clairvoyance, which was renamed to remote viewing, the perception of contemporary events happening outside the range of normal perception.
And leave it to physicists to draw like borders and Venn diagrams around witchy things. But my question is, why are there physicists involved in this in the first place?
That is a great question. The idea of remote viewing received renewed attention in the 90s upon the declassification of documents related to the Stargate project, a $20 million research program sponsored by the U.S. government that ran from 1975 to 1995 and attempted to determine potential military applications of psychic phenomenon.
Okay, all checks out now. Now we're cooking. So, just occurred to me now. I'm already going off book. 20 million over 20 years. Very tiny for
It is. It's
a
not a
DoD
lot.
thing.
But you can imagine how there are some people who are seeing red about the idea of spending even $1 on the government researching psychic warfare.
Yeah. So I'm just going to go out on a limb here and say Wikipedia doesn't have a whole lot of nice things to say about this topic.
You're not wrong. For those of you who may not know, Wikipedia has a decided bent against parapsychology and things that they deem as pseudoscience. You're never going to find much about UFOs on Wikipedia. It's it's an editorial decision. It's a community moderated thing. I don't object to anybody doing that, but it does mean that you tend to find some really downer paragraphs on Wikipedia when you go to look up stuff like this. Case in point, on remote viewing, Wikipedia says, the program ended after evaluators concluded that remote viewers consistently failed to produce actionable intelligence information. There is no scientific evidence that remote viewing exists, and the topic of remote viewing is generally regarded as a pseudoscience.
Yeah, that tracks. But we're talking about it, which means I suspect you're going to bring up some things.
Case closed. Shortest episode ever. Thanks for coming, everybody.
We're done. Thanks.
Remote viewing. It's all bullshit.
Yeah, Wikipedia says so. But okay, so this was 30 years ago. What got you thinking about it right now?
That's a great question, Chuck. Yeah, there are a few reasons we're talking about remote viewing right now. First of all, as you may or may not have heard, Big Daddy Lou Elizondo has a book coming out soon. Anybody who doesn't remember, Lou Elizondo was the head of the Pentagon's secret UFO program, ATIP. This was disclosed back in the 2017 New York Times article. He was kind of the original UFO whistleblower. The word on the street is that Lou was trained as a remote viewer. So I suspect his book is going to touch on that, and we will be talking about his book in a future episode. And remote viewing is a big and hairy enough topic that I was like, boy, do I not want to derail the discussion about Lou's book into a whole sub-discussion about what is remote viewing and is it real? Like, that's a big enough topic. I think it's worth an episode on its own.
Okay.
Second of all, you mentioned Venn diagrams earlier.
Yeah.
It's tempting to think, okay, UFOs, paranormal phenomenon, and there's no overlap. But in reality, there tends to be a weird amount of overlap between ghosts, psychic phenomenon, poltergeists, Bigfoot, like all this stuff that we kind of think of as pseudoscience with UFOs. So, I mean, it's right in the intro of our show, right? Like, once you accept that UFOs are real, where do you draw the line on the spectrum of like plausible to implausible? I don't fault anyone for finding some of the stuff further down the line to be implausible, but we used to think the line was over on the far side of UFOs, and now it's shifted. So with UFOs, there's often a psychic component. First of all, anybody who claims to have spoken to aliens often reports that they engage in telepathic communication. Also, UFOs, like completely ignoring aliens, just the UFOs, just the light you see in the sky, are widely reported to react to thought and intention, such as moving when asked or even being summoned via meditation protocols. So there's an uneasy boundary here where the psychic crosses over with the UFOs. And we don't talk about that a lot. This show tends to stick more on the nuts and bolts side of the discussion. Frankly, because I think it's a lot easier to conceptualize and talk about. But if you dig into this for any amount of time, you're gonna bump up against what Jacques Vallée refers to as high strangeness. Like, the UFO phenomenon is not easily compartmentalized. And when it comes to psychic phenomenon, there is definitely an overlap. So is there a direct connection between UFOs and remote viewing? Maybe, maybe not. But Big Daddy Lou is writing a book. He was a remote viewer. UFOs respond to psychic phenomenon. Lastly,
so sorry, I just had a thought. you mentioned being summoned by meditation protocols.
Mhm.
Made me wonder if the Buddha actually didn't ascend, but was abducted. You
Maybe.
know, hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah, we're gonna need an episode about that.
yeah, yeah. So lastly, I've got a quote from Dean Radin. We're going to be talking about him quite a bit
Okay.
today. He is a scientist who worked in the Stargate program, that
Oh, cool.
secret military remote viewing program. Dean says, one of the things I learned in the program was on the outside of the building at SRI, the Stanford Research Institute, there was all this talk about, oh, psychic whatever is nonsense. It doesn't exist. It's all fantasy. But inside the building, during our daily work, that's what we were studying. Well, why was that split? The split is because the value of such a program is that everyone else thinks it's nonsense, because then they're not looking into it. I kind of suspect that some of that has been going on in the UFO world too. People make fun of it. They say there's nothing here. It's all nonsense, because it's a way of deflecting attention.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, we see that with UFOs. Like publicly, the military sends Sean Kirkpatrick to say nothing here. But according to Grush, they've actually got a ton of stuff there. So
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Hmm.
So, yeah, I mean,
so I wonder if I kind of wonder. So, like this project Stargate was, you said was declassified. I wonder if that's like the ultimate bluff. It's like so much bigger than Sean Kirkpatrick. It's like, oh, it's so not here. We've declassified everything. You can
that's
look.
pretty interesting. Yeah, maybe. Yeah. It's the decoy deep black program. Oh yeah, look, you found it. You found our program. That's the one. There's nothing else. Don't bother looking.
Yep.
Yeah. So I think the main thing is Wikipedia and others have this perception that remote viewing may have been something the government looked into. Now, first of all, I think most people, when they hear that, that is itself a startling statement. What do you mean the government had a psychic warfare program for
Dude,
20
you've broken
years?
You've broken me. At this point, I'm like, of course they did. Of course they did.
I can buy that they did it for a year or two, but if they kept it up for 20 years, that kind of implies there was something to it.
Yeah.
But it's hard to get around the fact that, officially at least, the program was shut down in 1995. The reason it was declassified was so the CIA, who was running the program at that time, could hire outside scientists to evaluate it and determine if there was anything worth studying there. So I think the question that a lot of people have fairly is, does it work? Because if they shut down the program, that kind of implies it doesn't, right? So coming back to Dean Radin, he has a quote directly on this. He says, remote viewing definitely works. For those who hold the opinion that they got rid of the program because it didn't work, all you need to do is actually look at the formal report that was written for the CIA to evaluate it, in which the conclusion was, well, maybe it doesn't work for operational missions, but the phenomenon exists. This was a report written by Jessica Utz and Ray Hyman, who were on the two sides of the argument here. Ray Hyman even admitted that the phenomenon looks like it's real, and Jessica, of course, said, yeah, I've looked at all the data, and it is real.
So, wow. So if the scientists say that it exists, like, I don't know, what does that mean?
That is a really good question. It means that statistically speaking, they get better results than pure chance. Now, I've seen wildly different numbers ranging from 5% better than pure chance to 50% better than pure chance. But let me quote directly from the two scientists who wrote that CIA evaluation. So, first of all, we have Jessica Utz, who is a statistician at UC Davis.
Okay.
She says, using the standards applied to any other area of science, it is concluded that psychic functioning has been well established. The statistical results of the studies examined are far beyond what is expected by chance. Arguments that these results could be due to methodological flaws in the experiments have been soundly refuted. Effects of similar magnitude have been replicated at a number of laboratories across the world. Such consistency cannot be readily explained by claims of flaws or fraud. And Ray Hyman, who was kind of brought in to be the skeptic, who is a psychologist at the University of Oregon, said, "I want to state that we agree on many points. Jessica and I both agree that the experiments being assessed were free of the methodological weaknesses that plagued early research. We also agree that the experiments appear to be free of the more obvious and better known flaws that can invalidate the result of parapsychological investigations. We agree that the effect sizes reported are too large and consistent to be dismissed as statistical flukes." Now, I didn't 100% understand what all that meant. There's an excellent article on the Psi Encyclopedia that talks about remote viewing, and they talked about these two quotes, and they said, this is really important because what Hyman, who is a significant skeptical critic, was admitting was that the way in which remote viewing experiments were conducted and the way they were analyzed was no longer a matter for dispute. Remote viewing cannot be explained away as some artifact resulting from how the data were collected or evaluated.
That's crazy. So they both agreed. It's like that Gowron quote from Star Trek. Like, what could be better than your friend and your enemy both telling you the same thing?
So I love you're the one who went for a Star Trek quote.
Yeah, it was DS9. So they both agreed that it works, right?
Well, that's what Dean Radin says. And the reason I went and looked up the original sources was because it felt a little too pat, and it was. Jessica Utz definitely says this is real. And what she is responding to is commonly experiments were done that, quote unquote, real scientists would come in and look at it and go, this is all garbage. Obviously your methodology is all wrong. Jessica Utz says, look, it's replicable. The experiments are sound. The statistics are sound. There is something here more than pure chance. Full stop. You cannot argue with that. Okay. Hyman was forced to acknowledge the same thing, but he was very clear that he was not convinced that remote viewing was real. What he was willing to admit is the methodology was sound, something was happening that resulted in results more than chance, and it was worth further study.
Sure. So if they both agree it's worth further study, why cancel the program?
That is a really good question. The answer is that Utz and Hyman did not make the recommendation directly to the CIA. The CIA hired a group called AIR, the American Institutes for Research, who then hired Utz and Hyman as their blue ribbon panel to investigate it. They then summarized their findings, and AIR offered this conclusion. The foregoing observations provide a compelling argument against continuation of the program within the intelligence community. Even though a statistically significant effect has been observed in the laboratory, these conditions have limited applicability and utility for intelligence gathering operations. The information provided by remote viewing is vague and ambiguous, making it difficult, if not impossible, for the technique to yield information of sufficient quality and accuracy of information for actionable intelligence. Thus, we conclude that continued use of remote viewing in intelligence gathering operations is not warranted.
Yeah. Okay. So works in a lab, but doesn't work in the field, or I don't know. But for regular intelligence gathering.
Totally. Now, there was obviously, as there always is, some, pushback from, for example, one of the former program managers who was like, yo, you guys didn't actually look at all of the data and they wouldn't talk to me, which is a weird oversight when you're evaluating a program, not talking to the people who work in the program. But put all of that aside. We've got another good quote here from Dean Radin. He says, the question about a program like this is how useful it is.
Right.
Do we want to spend what amounts to $1 million a year to use something which is not as reliable as a spy satellite? And the answer to that is We absolutely should be doing that because a spy satellite costs $1 billion or more. And here we're talking about 1,000th of that budget for an entire year to begin to learn more and more about the nature of this phenomena and make it more reliable.
Yeah. Yeah, but it probably shouldn't be the military spending that money. Like
Maybe.
they can't send in assassins or whatever to do a thing based on fuzzy anyways. But so let's assume we found a group like the NSF or something that does want to study. How do you even study that?
That's a very, very good question. And I was curious about this myself. I've got a quote here from Jessica Utz, the statistician who was part of the CIA evaluation. Excuse me. She says, at the heart of any statistical method is a definition of what should happen randomly or by chance. Without a random mechanism, there can be no statistical evaluation. There is nothing random about the responses generated in anomalous cognition experiments. In other words, there is no way to define what they would look like by chance. Therefore, the random mechanism in these experiments must be in the choice of the target. In that way, we can compare the response to the target and answer the question, if chance alone is at work, what is the probability that a target would be chosen that matches this response as well or better than does the actual target? In order to accomplish this purpose, a properly conducted experiment uses a set of targets defined in advance. The target for each remote viewing session is then selected randomly in such a way that the probability of getting each possible target is known.
I thought I understood this the first time I read it, and now I'm not sure I do. It sounds like what she was saying is you can't do short answer questions. It has to be something like multiple choice.
I'm going to jump ahead a little bit here.
I think it's more. Yeah, okay.
There's a famous psi experiment that you probably remember if you've seen the film Ghostbusters. Do you remember early on?
Yeah.
Bill Murray is holding up a set of flashcards. And on Bill Murray's side, there are shapes on the flashcard, a triangle, a set of wavy lines. And he's asking this attractive co-ed across from him to tell him what the shape is. Now, the idea is she's reading the shape from his mind. Now, Bill, being Bill, is hitting on her and is giving her all sorts of hints and tainting the data. That is a real test called Zener card naming. And a common problem they had with those tests was what's called the decline effect. The test is long and slow and boring. And even subjects who showed abilities at the start of the test performed worse and worse the longer the experiment ran until they dropped down to the baseline of pure chance. So with a flashcard thing, you've got a very easy statistical thing. There are 30 cards in the deck. If I hold one up, you have a 1 in 30 statistical chance of guessing the right answer. Do enough samples and we get a statistically significant sample pool, and we can tell whether a person is actually outperforming the baseline. But with remote viewing, we'll talk in a moment about what that actually looks like. It's more of a conversation. I ask you, hey, what's at this location? And you give me your impressions of it. There's nothing statistical about that. So what she's saying is, in order to conduct a statistical experiment, there has to be a random element, and we can see how close you are. So what she's saying is the random element is what the person is viewing. So we have a set of things you can look at. We're going to pick them at random. And based on that, we can conduct a statistical experiment. So let's talk about what the experiment actually looks like. So Sci Encyclopedia says a remote viewing session is basically just two people having a very focused conversation for a specific purpose, with one person, the monitor, asking questions of another, the viewer, who responds to them.
Sure, it's no big deal. We're not trying to prove psychic phenomena are real. We're just having a conversation, you know. Don't let it.
Now, you're joking, but that's literally the intent. Because of the the decline phenomena that they had with other experiments.
Yeah.
They were literally looking for a more engaging and naturalistic format that would make it easier for people to have this easygoing rapport.
Sure.
There is quite a bit of evidence that the performance of the viewer is strongly impacted by their emotional state. Now,
Oh, yeah.
if you're in a lab just doing it for shits and giggles, there's very low pressure. If you're a military asset who has been brought in to tell me the location of the hostages,
right, yeah,
there's a bit of pressure, and you might be thinking, fuck, I got nothing. So the experiment is literally designed to constantly offer reassurance to the viewer, to slow things down and take the pressure off.
Yeah.
So we've jumped around in the script here a little bit, but to get back to what I had written here, that was the problem they were facing with the Zener card naming, right? The longer the experiment went, the worse people performed.
Yeah, I mean, that's me too at work. There's some cool research studies about this too. There's a study about judges' rulings over the course of a day, and it turns out that eating a cookie at 3 p.m. reduced the severity of sentences by like a huge amount. And lest you feel too sad about like that this had to be learned at all, because that affects a lot of lives, at least it is being studied and learned, which is great.
No, what's really funny about that, I forget, what is the term for that? Like cognitive overload, cognitive capacity, something like that. Anyway, the thing that I found fascinating about it is the place where they were studying that was in the Air Force, because pilots have to be able to make decisions very, very quickly. And so it's in the Air Force's best interest to understand, how do you make sure that pilots are going up in the best possible mental state? Well, an obvious answer is you don't send a pilot up when they're tired, but these kinds of studies looking into the average sentences that judges give before and after they've had a snack are outcomes from these original Air Force studies.
Got it.
So anyway,
decision fatigue.
Yeah, decision fatigue. Thank you. So the remote viewing protocol makes a bunch of changes to earlier psychic experiment protocols, but another notable one is linguistic, and it's a subtle thing, but remote viewing uses the term viewer or participant rather than subject. Sure. When you say subject, it implies an impartial researcher sitting at arm's length, dispassionately studying an experimental subject. Remote viewing acknowledges that both the viewer and the monitor are participating in the experiment and may influence the outcome.
Yeah, what do you mean by that? That's interesting.
So going back to Encyclopedia's description of it, in a remote viewing session, a typical viewer task might be, I will show you a target image tomorrow at 4 p.m. It is a location somewhere on the planet Earth. Can you please describe it for me in as much detail as you can? I have no idea what the target is, nor does anybody else. It will be randomly selected by a computer at 4 p.m. tomorrow. That is an example of a typical triple blind precognition protocol. Triple blind in that the viewer doesn't know it, the monitor doesn't know it, but also the computer that will select it doesn't know it yet. They will make the determination tomorrow. At the time that the session data was gathered, there was no target selected, and so no one could know what it would be.
So when you were reading that off, I was like, man, that seems like how I would talk to GPT. Like, please just hallucinate a thing for me. And I wonder if it works.
Maybe.
But anyway, so they're using blind protocols, and it sounds like it's kind of like deliberately designed to get away from the Ghostbusters Bill Murray thing, right?
That's exactly it. A common skeptical complaint of early psychic research. And you heard the Hyman and Utz both mentioned, like, these studies are free of the methodological problems that plagued early research. Early research would have exactly this problem. There were the monitor would unintentionally give clues to
Right.
the participant. And even early remote viewing experiments, you can go back and look at the notes, and they would make references to things that would give the person a clue. Sometimes they would do things like give them longitude and latitude coordinates. Now, in theory, I don't know what's a longitude and latitude coordinate, but in practice, you can learn what latitude and long, what part of the globe it's on. And if I know you've given me a coordinate that's probably in Russia, that's probably going to influence my thinking. So
Sure.
you can see as these remote viewing protocols go further and further, they are increasingly rigorously designed to stave off criticism by doing things like factoring in more blinds. We're giving zero information. In fact, you cannot give any information. It doesn't exist yet.
Interesting.
Here's a funny bit from that article. Another use of this protocol was to pick the winners of a horse race.
Sure.
Different locations were assigned to the different horses running a particular race at a particular track. The viewers were told that at a certain time the next day, they would be taken to a location, and they were asked to describe that location. Unbeknownst to the viewer, the horse race, which is run after the session data had been collected, would determine the location they had been taken to. So horse A might be the beach, horse B might be the forest, horse C might be the bridge. And you're going to, the winner of the race determines where you take them. But before the race is run, you ask them to describe the location they're going to.
Interesting.
And they end up predicting the outcome of the horse race.
Okay. Interesting. So, God, this actually sounds like some of the quantum mechanics studies.
Very similar. If you talk to the people who are seriously investigating this, they are all in on quantum mechanics because
I bet
fundamentally they are describing something that the traditional physicalist model of the universe, where everything is matter driven and consciousness is just a byproduct that arises from something about our meat bodies. Quantum mechanics kind of undoes that and implies that there is connection between everything and spooky action at a distance. And once you have that, psi phenomena doesn't seem like quite as big of a stretch as it did under the physicalist model.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay.
Now, here's the funny part. You can probably guess where this is going.
Yeah.
A review of multiple remote viewing experiments, like the horse racing one, was conducted by Nantes University. They said, quote, "The results suggest that the mean scoring rate in a binary situation is around 63%. If these results could be confirmed, this would falsify theories that predict it is impossible to use psi in a consistent and robust way. And moreover, it could be the end of the financial problems in the field of psychic research."
Sure. Yeah. So if they get this right, they can bet on the stock market and never have to ask the government for money again.
You guys tell us that this stuff doesn't work, but we've been funding our program by betting on horse races.
Yeah. So, this says to me also that it didn't work because otherwise they would have done that.
Well, I think an important
detail
there is they said their statistical survey showed 63%.
Sure. Yeah.
That's not a great hit ratio.
Yeah.
So this kind of gets to the problem that we're going to be talking about this whole episode is there is a big difference between, as a scientist, being able to show that something is statistically significant. This is not pure chance. There's something here. Versus this is practical and applicable. If I can do something 51% of the time, that's better than chance. But it's not much better than chance.
Yeah, but if you get 15 agents to confirm and do the same experiment, that 63% quickly becomes 80, 90. It just seems like they would scale this up.
Yeah, exactly. It takes a certain structure. It's not as simple as, okay, we hired a psychic and now we're good.
Yeah.
So let's talk about Project Stargate. So we've talked a bit about what is remote viewing. We've talked a bit about how do you even begin to study something like this. So Project Stargate is the reason we're here talking about. This is the secret government program. This is a deep black program where they are paying for research into psychic warfare. What is this? How did this happen? So I've been telling you about Dean Radin. Dean Radin is a scientist. He's the chief scientist at the Institute of Noetic Studies, or IONS. I don't know what noetics means, but long story short, this was the institute that former astronaut Edgar Mitchell created. We've talked about him before. He's tied up in the Wilson Davis memo. But Edgar Mitchell was the sixth man on the moon. He was one of the Apollo astronauts. Serious guy. He was also, I believe, the first astronaut to publicly talk about the overview effect, where seeing the Earth from space gave you this incredible feeling of connectedness. And literally that experience is what caused him to come home and create an institute to apply modern science to studying what he called inner space, psi phenomenon, and stuff like that. So Dean Radin worked at Bell Labs. He's worked at Princeton. He worked at SRI for a while on Project Stargate for the government. He is now the chief scientist at IONS. So that's the context that I came across him, was in an interview. But I was fascinated when he started talking about how he came to Project Stargate.
Yeah.
So in a nutshell, back when he was working at Bell Labs, they had, kind of like Google does, they had like 5% time or 10% time.
Sure.
It wasn't officially like that. It's just that everybody's doing experiments and you would have downtime where you're waiting for everyone else. So it was expected that you could do independent research during that time. So while he's working at Bell Labs in his own time, he does some parapsychology research. And he gave a talk on an experiment that he did on precognition at a conference. And he was approached and invited to join the Stargate program, which was still classified, but there were rumors about it. So just like today, we hear rumors about the crash recovery and reverse engineering program, there were rumors at the time. In fact, SRI had published some papers on remote viewing in peer-reviewed journals. So there was definitely a hint that SRI, via a government contract, was studying remote viewing.
Okay, so this wasn't, when you said Bell Labs at first, like, he wasn't doing this on behalf of Bell Labs.
It's complicated. He was doing it officially at Bell Labs during his day job. But I think the easiest way to think of it is the same way that a Google engineer has 10% time.
Right.
You can't do whatever you want during that time. It's still expected that you're doing something that ultimately contributes to the company. I think this is the same thing. There's a bit more flexibility what you do during that downtime. In his case, he was doing parapsychological research.
Yeah. I always kind of imagine Bell Labs as being like very down to earth. And this kind of paints them in a different picture, but I guess it was different times too.
I mean, also, as far as I can tell, all of the big name research labs did some research into psi phenomenon in the 70s and 80s. Like, it was just kind of in the air. Yeah. So Dean Radin says, I took a leave of absence from Bell Labs for the calendar year 1985. After I got my clearances, Hal Pudoff, who was the director at the time, gave me the briefing that everyone gets when they go through this process. And that blew my mind, because some of it was experimental work, but some of it was operational work. There was a program actually active where people were using this for operational purposes. So I saw examples of those operational missions and the results of them, and saw for the first time that if you're dealing with people with high talent, you can get almost veridical drawings, like photographic drawings of things that no one on our side of the pond knew, yet later turn out to be verified through human intelligence and satellites and so on.
Wow. So he thought he was joining like a research program, and finds out, oh shit, actually it's operational intelligence program.
Which is why it's classified, right?
Right. Yeah.
Now, I am glossing over a bit here that some of our listeners, I'm sure, are like, wait, hold on. Talk more about the accurate predictions. I didn't dig into it myself. There
Oh,
are some out there. If you're interested, look up Ingo Swann and Ian McMonigal. Both of them are publicly out members who are on Project Stargate. They are widely regarded as some of the highest functioning remote viewers on the planet. Both of them have examples of work that they did for the government. Famously, one of the first things that happened when they spun up the remote viewing program internally at the DoD was they had some Army people go through what they thought was going to be an 18 to 24 month training program. In the middle of it, a plane crashed and they asked the remote viewing group to find it. And they pinpointed it to within 15 miles of the wreckage in the ocean. And they were able to go recover it. And from that point forward, the program went into operational mode. So you go view slides from the directors, and they're like, our training program was either accelerated or abruptly ended because we were now operational. We were being tasked with real world work. Ingo Swann, I believe, or maybe it was McMonigal, has a story about being given a set of coordinates, and he starts sketching his impressions of it. And he sketches this really large crane, this unusual crane structure. And years later, they confirmed it through spy photography, either satellites or like U-2 bombers or whatever. But they were able to show, yes, this facility he monitored, there was this big, unusual crane thing, and he saw it. Now, those are, of course, the success stories. And
sure.
I don't want to unfairly report only the success stories that they have told us. What I want to talk about is kind of the big picture of it. The big picture I'm getting of it, to be perfectly blunt with you, is they had some wins, but they had a lot of trouble putting it into operational practice. So
Sure, yeah.
The shocking thing, I think, to get back to Dean Radin, is he's a scientist. He's invited to join a research program at SRI working for the government.
Yeah.
And finds out this research program is also an operational psychic spy program.
Yeah.
Buck wild. Yeah.
Totally.
Now, he says the Stargate program was one of a whole bunch of programs. Stargate was just one code word. He says, when I was on the program, it was called Grill Flame. That was the name of the code word at the time. And for those of you who know about classification levels, this was a TS SCI special access program. So we know from our work on UFO stuff, TS is top secret, which everybody kind of understands. SCI is secure compartmented information, which means you're not allowed to learn about this without being in a secure facility. And special access program means you don't get to know about this program at all unless you're on the list.
Right.
So this is a top secret, secure, compartmented information, special access program. He says this was way down in the deep black. You had to sign a book to know the existence of the thing, and even to know what the code word was and what that code word meant. The reason for that was because there was overlap with operational missions. Many times you go into the top secret world when there are people and methods involved. If they became publicly known, their lives would be in danger and the methods would no longer be useful.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So I wonder if the worry was about exposing this program or site agents, or if it was like, hey, we're working together with special agents out in the field who, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I share your reaction here. I was like, okay, I understand, if you're dealing with spies doing field work, protecting names, sources, and methods is really critical. Those people are literally in danger. They're undercover in enemy territory. They can be shot. When we're dealing with a psychic who's in a laboratory at SRI, I'm not really sure what you need to protect the agent, but, this was the height of the Cold War. Presumably, they literally are worried about if word leaks that we've got this high functioning psychic who's able to look at any Russian facility on the planet, he might literally become an assassination target. I don't know.
I can imagine too that
it's just standard process,
Yeah, but I could imagine that they're given like a briefing on, hey, this is what we know so far. We're going to ask you some questions about this. And unfortunately, that just ends up doing a lot of priming and weirdness, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So Dean Radin goes on. He says, I got a chance to meet Ingo Swann and Joe McMoneagle and other people who are now well known for being quite good at this thing. And also a bunch of other people who are still not very well known, but were about as good. So there's a cadre of perhaps a dozen people who were remarkably skilled.
Sorry. Yeah. Sorry, I was looking up Ingo Swann and Joe McMoneagle's net worth, because I feel like I feel like they should be super duper rich, and the answers are just wild.
No, they're not. They're normal guys. Yeah.
Okay, so you said there was a dozen people. I can't tell if that's a lot or a little. Like,
right?
I don't know.
Like, on the one hand, like 12 high functioning, powerful psychics the government found. That's kind of that's cool. Kind of big news on its own. On the other hand, like, really? Just 12? Like, I don't know. I don't know what the right number would be. I don't know what number you could say. I'd be like, yeah, that's about right.
Yeah. I don't know.
So Dean says, I was working on precognition tests, and I would say most of what I was doing was involved in threat analysis. If there's one thing that gets the government excited about something, just as we're seeing with UFOs now, if there's a potential threat, then people get nervous and start allocating money to study the thing.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, we've talked about that before. Like, people criticizing Lou Elizondo and Chris Mellon for talking about threats, but it is a good way to get the military to spend money on something.
In fact, I would argue it's almost impossible to get the military to spend money
almost
on
the only way.
It has no threat profile. Like,
right,
okay,
yeah.
Why do we care?
Yeah.
So Dean says threat assessment was a big piece of it. And that meant looking at claims from publications that we would get out of China or the Soviet Union at the time. And even claims that we saw from the open press and open literature. Could we believe this or not? Is this a threat? Sometimes it would advance to the point where we would try to replicate some of the claims, like redo the experiment. And sometimes you could, and sometimes you couldn't.
Wait, I imagine, so the articles or the publications coming out of China and Soviet Union, like, are these like, hey, we think there's this kind of bomb? Or are they actually talking about, like, we think China and the Soviet Union have their own psychological warfare? Oh, okay. So when they say replicate one of the claims.
Now, some of it is like peer-reviewed papers out of Russia and stuff, but some of it is literally the whole reason they started this in the 70s was they had intelligence that Russia had their own psychic warfare program. Now, I don't think at the time anyone in the US believed that psychic warfare was a real thing. There was a genuine concern that this was just disinformation being sent to lead us down a wild goose chase. But they couldn't take a chance that Russia would develop an all-powerful psychic spy and we've got nothing. So they had to spin up a research program to look into it. And once they started looking into it, they found out there is something to it. Which I imagine came as a surprise even to the people who signed the check. Like, what, really? Right. You guys found something?
God, can you imagine being that officer? Like, this can't be right.
Right?
Take it back.
Yeah. Now, I'm not going to get into the weeds with this. There's a lot here, as you can imagine. Yeah. But I will just say, similar to what we have seen with UFO programs, where there is quite obviously a divide in the government between people who think this is worth looking into it and people who think it is absolutely not worth looking into, either because they think it's all bullshit or because they think it's the work of the devil. Psychic stuff, exact same divide, exact same problem. You have, different commanding officers coming in and out, gives you different levels of support. The program shifted around a few times. For a long time, it was at DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency. Later, it moved to the CIA, and the CIA was immediately like, do we want this thing? And that's when they commissioned the outside review. Like,
Interesting. Okay, so we've heard from scientists doing the research at Project Stargate. We know that they were able to demonstrate the phenomenon was statistically real. Yet the program was canceled because it wasn't providing results that they wanted. How can it be working in the lab but not the field?
That's a really good question. It was something I struggled to wrap my head around. On the CIA site, they have what they call the reading room, which is where they post all their Freedom of Information Act documents.
Oh, okay.
And I found they have a whole section in there about Project Stargate because the project was declassified. But I found one in particular called Psi Operational Capability that discusses exactly this problem of the difficulty between what we see in a lab and turning that into an operational intelligence program.
Nice. Okay.
I got a bunch of quotes here. First of all, since the DoD became involved with supporting psi research, a large number of attempts have been made to apply remote viewing to solve intelligence problems. The DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, has regularly tasked SRI to gather information on real events that were of intelligence interest. The Army has an operational unit at Fort Meade. They received many requests for intelligence information and responded to many and varied customers. All of this has been done without any attention being placed on the problem of how do you go from a research program to an operational capability? Until that's investigated, we should not expect huge successes on operational tasks. A prime example of the difficulty you encounter is that many of the operational tasks required search remote viewing. Where is this object? While all of the research was on site remote viewing. What is at this location?
Huh. Okay. So like, were they, were they building out capabilities the Army didn't need, or was the Army asking for capabilities that weren't possible?
I think both.
Both. Okay.
The research program is not actually a military program. It is a military funded program, but it's run by Russell Targ and Hal Puthoff and guys like that who are parapsychological researchers. Their bread and butter is conducting methodologically sound experiments to prove that this stuff is real. They find high functioning remote viewers, and they're working with them to determine how best do we study this? How best do we dig into this? At one point, Dean Radin talks about like there was, as you can imagine, research to look into why is Ingo Swann so good at this? Is there something genetically about him? Is, like, can we make a formula, like a serum that we can give to people? Like a lot of effort is put into why is this person good? But on the flip side of it, there's some details I'm about to get into. But basically, the Army found out it was real and just kind of went full steam ahead with it in a way that didn't actually match the way that the research said it needed to work. So continuing with the quotes, he says, the principal pitfall of doing operational remote viewing is the way it's currently done is that we present a facade of a capability we do not have. We are then judged by the customer on this basis, but never is it explained that we are responding due to the urgency of the situation, such as hostages in Beirut, and that we are not claiming to have a proven in-place operational capability. In addition, when we attempt to apply psi abilities, there's often not enough research to support our efforts. For instance, the Army puts their remote viewers through a training program and then calls them operational remote viewers. However, they have no evidence that the training program accomplishes what it claims. They also train their operational viewers in-house. They provide this training without conducting any research on the numerous and varied aspects of psi ability or training techniques.
Oh, God. This sounds like one of those like meme videos on YouTube where it's like a bad management company. Someone says, we're 75% done with this research task. And the boss says, great, so you can deploy 3/4 of it and we'll get the rest later. They're like, no, that's not how this works. We have 0 functional units. I'm like, yeah, but you had 75% done.
Yeah, exactly. It's easy to imagine. You've even speculated here about a few ways you could go from someone who is 50% better than chance, who is 51%. It's a 1% better than chance. And if you add enough people, you get something that's much better. But yeah, there are questions around how you translate from in a lab, statistically, we could say this is a thing, to, okay, now there's an intelligence operational group. So he goes on, he says, at present, there are 2 groups who do operational remote viewing. This is important, I think, because the impression we got up above was that there was the pure R&D side and there was the operational side. And what we're finding out here is there's SRI and there's the Army, and they're both doing operational, but they're doing it differently. The first group is a rather diffuse unit. It consists of a variety of people who are associated with SRI. It includes consultants, subcontractors, and people with good performance records in remote viewing. The problems are that they're widely scattered from coast to coast and may not be available, and it requires time to assemble them. And time is often very critical, and there's no facility in which to work. So what happens is we scurry around, pull in whoever we can as fast as we can, and present the problem. If maps or documents are needed, they may not be available. In addition, funds to mount an operational effort have to be taken from other tasks. You know, like SRI has a budget that the government has given them. Every time we ask them to do operational stuff, it takes money away from other stuff. In summary, this group is not a group standing by to do operational remote viewing, and SRI is not set up to acquire intelligence information.
Sure.
This is all thrown together using whatever resources are available whenever a problem arises. And this is certainly admirable on the part of both SRI and the various remote viewers, but it is not the best way to acquire accurate data through application of remote viewing.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is the group that Dean Radin was working with?
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Ingo Swann, Joe McMoneagle, most of the time they're doing research, but every now and then the military would come in and give them an operational task, and they'd kind of grab whoever was available and respond as best they could.
Yeah. Like, I can already see why this collapsed. Like, just the terrible management alone is going to do this program in. Whether remote viewing worked or not, this program was already dead long before it started.
Yeah, and I think the problem is what they were setting up at SRI was a research team. And they appear to have operated very well as a research team. They were able to effectively prove that remote viewing is a thing. But they were being asked to go beyond research, and they weren't prepared for that. They weren't trained for that. In another document, they note that it's one thing to train someone to do remote viewing. It's another thing to train someone to do remote viewing in a way that gathers actionable intelligence. We don't just send spies into the field and say, tell us whatever you see. We tell them the things we're looking for. There are things they are trained to report on and things like that. Similarly, if we're just having a remote viewer and we're saying, what do you feel when you look at this location? Okay, well, you know, you're telling me it's cold. That may be accurate. Is it operational? Is it useful? I don't know, you know?
Yeah.
Now, the flip side of this coin is the Army group. He says the second operational group is the unit at Fort Meade. It consists of Army personnel who were selected and trained to do remote viewing. Their problems are that no selection criteria were available, and they were submitted to an unevaluated training program, which was completed by only one member who has now left the unit. Whereas the SRI group is managed by scientists with extensive experience and understanding in researching psi phenomena, the Army group has no one associated with it who has any understanding of psi phenomena or experience in researching or utilizing remote viewing. Since they are unaware of what can or cannot be done, they oversell their capability in an attempt any problem presented to them by customers. They also have no method by which to evaluate what they have done, and therefore are not in a position to direct applications research. While they have mounds of data, it has not been synthesized in a manner that can depict their success or failure in the mission that they are chartered to perform. Essentially, what you have is a group of amateurs led by another amateur being trained by another amateur. Success in any science is rarely achieved by an amateur. Hence, it is not surprising that the results produced by their group have not been astounding. Damn!
Yeah. That feels bound to fail super hard. Like, I don't know. I see this at work where people are given programs but not given the support they need to make it happen. And it's just like sad to watch them invest so much emotional effort. And just like before they even started, this was
Yeah.
going down in flames and you just don't even know it yet.
Well, and it's hard because I think the mission changed.
Yeah.
Right? Like
Yeah.
it started as, yo, we hear the Russians are starting a psychic warfare program.
Right.
Can you look into that? Is that even a thing? And they
Right.
come back and they go, actually, it is a thing.
Could be.
Well, holy shit. Okay, well, here's $1 million. Keep studying it. And every year they go, here's another $1 million. Keep the program going. While simultaneously setting up an operational unit that claims to be able to do intel gathering via this method.
Right.
Now, even ignoring the fact that in real world intelligence, you don't ever operate with a single source of intel. This would only ever have been one of several. We've got this remote viewer who says there's this submarine construction facility off the coast of Russia. And also a spy plane flew overhead and saw a lot of construction material there. And also one of our sources on the ground tells us, okay, we feel very strongly about this.
Yeah.
But if I'm just coming to you saying, yeah, psychic saw a submarine off the coast, like, okay, I guess.
No.
Not to mention that very rarely were they getting a psychic said there was a submarine. It's we asked a psychic what was in this location, and they described it was cold and wet and a lot of pressure and metal and military, and we think they mean a submarine, you know, like,
yeah.
So what I find really frustrating is, as usual, as with anything in the world, like UFOs and stuff, people tend to want to put it into a black and white thing. It's real or it isn't. Yeah. You've got the people on the one side who are like, remote viewing is real, psychics are real, everything is real. Of course, the military shut it down because they're idiots or they're lying to us or whatever. And then you've got the skeptics who are like, obviously, this is all bullshit. And sure, the government studied it for 20 years, but they shut it down. They wouldn't have shut it down if it worked. So therefore, it doesn't work.
Right.
And as usual, there's a bit of nuance here, right? Like, there is a big difference between they shut it down because it doesn't work and they shut it down because they didn't see how to turn it into an operational program.
Right. Yeah.
Should they have been able to overcome that? Are there ways to overcome that? Probably, but it doesn't change the fact that they didn't shut it down because it doesn't work. They shut it down because it doesn't work the way they needed it to work.
Right.
But the flip side of it is when scientists like Hal Puthoff and Dean Radin come out and says remote viewing is real, it is demonstrably real. That's true, but it's not what most people think of. If I came up to you and said remote viewing is real, what you probably imagine I mean is there's a protocol I do where I can reliably get information about something at a distance. And all the scientists are saying is we tested it, and statistically, it's better than guessing.
Right.
That's a different claim. And
totally
it's exciting and it's interesting. And I'm fascinated by the implications of it. But it's not really saying what people think it's saying. So, like, we're in this weird, confusing, frustrating in between where there is demonstrable reality, statistical significance to psi phenomena, including remote viewing. Undeniable, like, replicable studies have shown this over and over again. But that is not the same thing as saying it's real in the way that people think it's real. And I wish there was room for people to hear more nuance when we talk about this stuff.
Yeah, no, I get that. And I think the biggest shame is that all the people in the world equipped to do this, I feel like they should have seen it coming.
Yeah. I will say I place the blame for that on the DoD, not on
of course
the scientists who were just here to study it. Like, the fact that they get tarred with the brush of a failed DoD program when they weren't trying to run a DoD program, I think is unfair. We talked, you may not remember this, in a very early episode, we were talking about Tom DeLonge, and one of his advisors was Hal Puthoff. and you were like, yeah, I looked this guy up. He's bullshit. And I think what you did was you looked at his Wikipedia page. It's like, he studies parapsychology and pseudoscience, and he's got papers talking about how remote viewing is worth. You're like, yeah, okay, whatever.
Yeah, I'm over.
But learning a little bit more about how this stuff actually works, I actually have quite a bit more faith in guys like this, because Hal Puthoff and guys like him are not out here saying the crazy things people are saying, but they're also not doing a great job at communicating what they actually mean. And I don't think that's their fault. I think that's a problem science has across the board. And what we have here is a perfect storm of science not really knowing how to talk about a thing, and the military not really knowing how to operationalize a thing, and everybody walking away frustrated and blaming the other side. Like, well, yeah, of course it didn't work. You know, like,
totally. Have you read Hal Puthoff's papers? I think it'd be interesting to see.
It would be interesting to see, and I should. But yeah, to be honest with you, no, I've read very few of the papers. I tend to get to the abstract page, and even the abstract page is like way too like science terminology heavy for me. I have to find somebody else to interpret it for me. So I will admit that when you're hearing me talk about this stuff, you're hearing it third or fourth hand, you know, like I may be totally wrong. I don't know, but
well, I will say you've thoroughly dampened my my closing joke by saying they should have seen it coming. But
God damn it. I didn't realize it was a joke. It's so obvious in hindsight. I thought you were just being like, yeah, well, they should have seen it coming. They're psychics. They should have seen it coming. That was a good joke.
That was much more gratifying.
So, to bring it all back to the beginning, why are we talking about remote viewing on a UFO podcast? The blunt answer is Lou Elizondo's book is about to drop. And the word is Lou Elizondo was trained in remote viewing while in the military. Now, I don't know for sure, but that sounds like he was part of this program at Fort Meade, which means I'm going to be really interested to see what, if anything, Lou Elizondo says about the program, because it is worth noting everything we have heard about the failures of the Fort Meade program are in the context of the CIA evaluation and cancellation of the project.
Right.
I also don't know, when the CIA shut down Project Stargate, I think that meant the research at SRI. Did that also shut down the Army unit, or is there still an operational remote viewing Army unit? I don't know. So I look forward to seeing what, if anything, Lou Elizondo has to say about it. But if it turns out that Lou is one of these like amateurs trained by an amateur, run by an amateur, like, I don't know, I'm like a little more skeptical of that. But
it could be interesting. Like you and I have been amateurs trained by amateurs doing amateur things who end up becoming professionals because we do it for long enough and read things and are smart cookies. Who knows?
Who knows? Yeah. Now, the one thing that I will say here is I came into this not really sure about remote viewing. I would not call myself a skeptic, but my hesitation in doing an episode on remote viewing is where we've done the UFO stuff long enough that I feel like I have a really good sense of what I can say with certainty and what I can't. I mean, case in point, you know, like we joke about it in our opening. Now that the government has confirmed they've recovered they haven't confirmed they've recovered non-human craft. A whistleblower says that. But the government has absolutely confirmed that UFOs are real and existed. And that was kind of the trigger for this whole podcast, is that statement is so shocking on its face for someone who was raised in the 80s and the 90s when the answer was no, this is all bullshit, that it threw me for a complete loop. I came into the remote viewing thing not knowing if it was going to be a similar thing. Are we dealing with the same kind of thing? We're like, oh, it's all bullshit, but actually it's real? Or is it the kind of thing where everybody says it's real, but you dig into it, it's like, okay, yeah, it's real, but with some pretty big scare quotes around it? Or is it just all bullshit and it's all, you know, flim flam run by con men? I don't know. And I get really hesitant bringing things to this show that I don't
Yeah.
feel like I can put a pretty good pin in. And
Mm.
I genuinely wasn't sure coming into this what I was going to find. And
Right.
it took me a while to kind of construct a narrative around this. But I feel pretty happy with this outcome. What I feel I can say with high confidence is there is proven statistical evidence
Right.
of psi phenomena, including remote viewing. There was an attempt at an
Something.
operational intelligence gathering program that was ultimately deemed a failure for reasons that are perhaps unrelated to whether or not remote viewing is a real thing, and maybe
Right.
more an organizational structural problem, which, as people who have worked in organizations and structures for years, makes me and Chuck laugh a lot because, yeah, it's always an
It's
organizational
always
problem.
that way. Yeah.
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 How do you feel? This was a big one. This is a weird one. Where are you at on this?
I I think the stats are really like that a statistician looked at it and was convinced is actually a really cool sign to me. And
Mm-hmm.
I could absolutely believe that there is something there. But I also think that humans are incredibly capable of bias. and
Yes.
uh, and especially in like the 70s we were still doing some real shitty psychology practice. Even in the 90s, we still hadn't had our like our series of psychology like oh shit moments. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so I don't know. I think it'd be interesting to try and replicate now. It'll also be fascinating to get them in an EKG
Yeah.
or like um, an MRI, an fMRI or something, and see
Yeah.
like
It's worth noting that all of the quotes we heard about the program were from Dean Radin, who was
mhm.
in a 20-year program for 1 year in the dead
Right.
middle of it. How much medical experimentation did they do? Based on his one throwaway comment about them putting a lot of work into figuring out how can you replicate these high functioning guys, I wouldn't be surprised if they did do stuff like that. But where is that research? Are we ever going to see it? I don't know.
I don't know, but it'd be. So the other thing is like we know there's a number of billionaires who are happy to do weird shit. What this feels like a total like exactly what they would want to do. Why aren't
Yeah.
they? Or are they?
Robert Bigelow is.
Right.
Specifically, what he's digging into is life after death stuff.
Okay.
So he was heavily involved in UFO stuff for a while, Skinwalker Ranch, paranormal
Yeah.
stuff there. He has since shifted his focus, perhaps because he is himself getting older,
Yeah.
into
Right.
what happens after we die. And that's where a lot of his work is happening. But yeah, it is really interesting to see what happens when someone comes in with money and says, okay, what do I need to do?
Right. Yeah.
I've got the funds.
$1 million a year is nothing if you want to keep a
Stuff.
science program going for a billionaire.
Mm-hmm.
Man, if I was a billionaire, I would have so many weird ass programs running. Like it'd just be
100%.
like the Chuck Science Foundation. God, it would just be weird shit wall to wall.
Yeah, the Chuck Weird Science Foundation.
Yes, I love it. the Lauervos Foundation for weird and wet science.
Wet science, I forgot. Oh man. All right.
Yeah.
On that note,
Yep.
thank you all for joining us on It's a Very Exciting Time. You can find show notes and more on our website, veryexcitingtime.com, as well as links to our social media accounts.
And you can feel free to email us at Scott or Chuck at veryexcitingtime.com. Hit us up on Discord. And if you'd like to support the show, check out our Patreon at patreon.com/veryexcitingtime.
And Chuck, as always, my wife thanks you for listening to me talk about UFOs so she doesn't have to.